From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. Military exercises continue in Venezuela with all branches of the Bolivarian armed forces deployed along the border with Colombia. The president and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Nicolás Maduro, ordered the Venezuela Sovereignty and Peace 2019 drills. President Maduro said all defensive systems are being tested in order to safeguard Venezuela's territorial integrity amid attempts to intervene from Colombia. Heads of the military say that the country's defense will not fall into provocations.
Venezuela has people who defend it, with ideas, with words, with politics, with diplomacy, and with weapons if it's necessary, to defend it with weapons. Venezuela has a Bolivarian nation armed forces, united to the people, ready, prepared, and well-armed to defend the homeland. Today has begun the deployment of the entire army, missile, anti-aircraft, air defense, comprehensive defense of the entire territory of the 2,219 kilometers of border with Colombia. The entire Bolivarian armed forces have been activated from today, the 10th, until the 28th.
Scotland's highest court of appeal has ruled that the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's suspension of Parliament is unlawful. The judges said the PM was attempting to prevent Parliament holding the government to account ahead of Brexit. The suspension, however, won't be immediately lifted, as the Supreme Court will now hear an appeal from the government. This judgment overturns an earlier ruling that the courts did not have the power to interfere in the Prime Minister's political decision. Parliament was prorogued on Tuesday and is not set to return until mid-October.
Each opinion expresses the view that the advice given by the government to Her Majesty the Queen to prorogue Parliament from 9th September to 14th October was unlawful, and that therefore the prorogation itself is unlawful.
U.S. President Donald Trump has sacked his National Security Advisor, John Bolton. This is the third security advisor Trump has fired. The president announced the decision on Twitter on Tuesday, saying he disagreed strongly with many of Bolton's decisions. Bolton has been one of the most aggressive members of the Trump administration, pushing for more sanctions and even military action against Venezuela and Iran. Trump says he will announce his fourth advisor next week. And reporters in the U.S. pressed the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, on the reasons behind the dismissal, which Bolton says was a resignation.
Look, I don't talk about the inner workings of how this all goes. We all give our candid opinions. There were many times Ambassador Bolton and I disagree, that's to be sure. But that's true for lots of people with whom I interact.
Just to follow up quickly on the original guidance for this briefing, Bolton was on the guidance to be here. So were you two blindsided by what occurred today? That he's no longer with the administration? Was it news to you today? Because last night you were told he would be here today.
Yeah, I'm never surprised.
Rescue teams in the Bahamas have continued to search for dead bodies following Hurricane Dorian, as the death toll is now 50. According to officials, more bodies are expected to be retrieved as many people still remain missing. In Marsh Harbor communities such as the Mud and Pigeonnet P, where 70% of informal housing existed, has been destroyed. The hurricane last week blasted the neighborhood's homes to pieces and reduced the area to a vast debris field of splintered wood, twisted metal, scattered personal belongings, and bodies.
We checked in with the Emergency Operations Center yesterday, and we received an assignment that we needed to do a body search in the area of Mud, which is where we are. That's the name of the sector. It's called Mud. And it's a shanty town that was pretty much completely washed away.
Bahamas National Security Minister Marvin Daines has responded to claims that authorities have underreported death toll.
And I want us to be extremely careful, that we're dealing with persons who would have gone through a wide range of emotions. And when we put this information out there in social media and in other spheres, it further complicates things. And it gives the impression as if the authorities are, I've heard some person saying, well, they're hiding the bodies. Why would we do that? Just tell me, what will it gain us to do such a thing? And so we have to take hold of this and always, when anything we print or anything we say, keep in mind those who would have endured tremendous loss. Once we can identify the bodies, and that's what the detectives are seeking to do with held personnel. Once we are able to identify the bodies, it is our intention to release the bodies to the family. We're not going to stack up bodies on bodies. If we can identify them, we will go through that process of releasing so that families can move forward with their lives.
Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard says there has been a significant decrease in U.S.-bound immigration through Mexico. He says that Mexico's strategy of putting more than 25,000 National Guard militarized police along its borders has been a success. Ebrard met with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence to review progress in the efforts to curb the surge of migrants traveling through Mexico from Central America. However, the foreign minister says that they will not be accepting the request by the U.S. for a safe third country agreement.
The third safe agreement, he asked McAleenan in the meeting his point of view. McAleenan, not surprising, is always in favor of. But I had the opportunity to explain the president that we are almost in 90% of the main objective, and Mexico don't consider the third safe country as a possible solution in this point, and we don't have authorization from our Senate and the President of Mexico to go in this direction.
Coming up, El Salvador's Attorney General seeks a third trial for Evelyn Hernandez, accused of having an abortion. Don't go away.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis, and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en la I.
Dotting the I. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. In El Salvador, feminist movements have taken to the streets against the Attorney General's request to reopen the case of Evelyn Hernandez. Ernesto Ábalos, our correspondent, has the details.
A number of feminist movements protested in front of the Attorney General's office against the public minister's decision to reopen the case of Evelyn Hernandez. Hernandez was accused of homicide for the death of her son when she was giving birth. She was freed on August 16, and now with this appeal presented by the public ministry, feminist organizations have decided to protest against this decision. The protest turned a bit violent as some of the women there threw stones, red paint, and other objects toward the Attorney General's office. The country's Attorney General, Raul Malera, has said that these actions only demonstrate there are no legal resources to defend Evelyn Hernandez. He also said they will continue to second the penal chamber with the request to reopen the case. In the days that follow, we will know the decision whether it will be in favor of Evelyn or if it will side with the public ministry.
That was Ernesto Avalos from El Salvador. On Monday, Colombia commemorated the National Day of Human Rights. This came during a time when the country endures a humanitarian crisis that has killed 149 social leaders in 2019 alone. Human rights experts blame an increase of paramilitary groups and systematic state abandonment for this situation.
According to official figures, 149 social leaders have been killed in Colombia in 2019 alone. The murders have taken place in 89 municipalities where the situation remains critical. These are places where drug trafficking and illegal economies are thriving.
In the last 3 weeks, there have been over 35 murders of social leaders and political candidates, 2 mayoral candidates who were killed recently. So we can call this terrorism. Discourse promoting war is also on the rise because we are allegedly threatened by foreign powers.
According to the Electoral Observation Mission, since July 27th until now, there have been 38 candidates who've fallen victims to violence, including 6 murders.
We have a total of 364 leaders, including 3 candidates who've been victims of violence or threats, as well as murders. We've seen that as time goes by, that where there is violence against politicians, there's also violence against social leaders.
One of those involved in this wave of violence is the FARC party, which has seen 145 of its former combatants murdered since the signing of the peace agreement in 2016.
On more than
one occasion, we have asked the President to sit with us to talk about the agreement, to talk about the implementation of effective measures, of the dismantling of paramilitary groups that exist in our country. They are the ones generating terror in Colombia. The paramilitary groups are the ones that are killing us.
For many, the outlook in Colombia is not encouraging, as the government continues to look for enemies abroad to justify the murder of social leaders.
The UN Refugee Agency and the African Union have signed a deal with Rwanda to host hundreds of migrants being held in Libya. According to a joint statement, a first group of 500 people will be evacuated, including children and youth at risk. Other evacuation flights for those willing to go to Rwanda are expected to begin in the coming weeks. Officials say over 4,000 people are estimated to be held in dire conditions in detention centers in Libya. Foreign nationals in South Africa's Carolhong township have sought refuge in community halls after being displaced by a recent wave of xenophobic violence. According to officials, about 850 people were forced to leave their homes that were robbed and burned to the ground. At least 12 people were killed by the surge of anti-foreigner violence in Johannesburg, the country's financial capital, last week. Foreign nationals have repeatedly called for support from the South African government and regional bodies.
I'm very scared, but in the news they are saying the fighting was finished, but we are still fighting. They are fighting with us, even today. So what I'm asking now, I'm homeless. They bent everything what belongs to me. It's only that I thank God because I'm still alive.
Once I get out of this gate, sometimes I'll get a shot. Some of the guys, their properties were not burnt there by the location, but when they tried to go with the police to take their possessions back, they were shot. You know, we're under a very serious threat, but I don't know what's going on with the government, because the government is just taking a little step.
The third International Trade Union Forum of Solidarity with Syria ended this Monday in Damascus. So let's have a look.
100 trade union delegations from around the world convened in Damascus, condemning the foreign terrorist war and an economic blockade directly affecting the lives of the Syrian people. In solidarity with the Syrian people, they agreed to develop a worldwide campaign taking aim at the governments and states which support terrorism, impose a human blockade on Syria, and while also manipulating the narrative on Syria. Participants of the event commended Syrian workers for being true combatants of their homeland at a time of war. They were lauded for maintaining their jobs in factories and other work in spite of the constant threat of terrorist attacks that up to date have resulted in the deaths of more than 9,000 workers, the wounding of another 14,000, while 3,000 were kidnapped by extremist groups. On behalf of workers of their respective countries, trade union representatives present in the forum urged the international community to support the Syrian people against the hostile, aggressive, and interventionist policies of Washington and its allies against Syria.
They were not able to bring down Syria with war, and even today they cannot break the Syrian people through the blockade and the sanctions. The Syrian people do not lower their guard despite all the challenges, and we are confident that they will continue their fight until they triumph. They will not cease to support their leadership and national army.
We denounce the media campaign which exists throughout this process that is being developed by the people of Syria. Undoubtedly, we believe that in all the nations which have a presence here, they'll be able to learn more about the realities and situation here. Without a doubt, the position of Cuba will be a position of firm support for the process taking place.
There are sanctions, as I mentioned before, on Syria, are taking place in so many other parts of the world. It's completely unacceptable, and the Canadian labor movement does support the people in Syria, and we're here to put pressure to take the sanctions away.
The war and the blockade have caused state losses which exceed $90 billion. Still, Syria's government has not abandoned the social and economic subsidy policy and has continued paying the employee wages. Meanwhile, workers continue to stand firm. They've resolved to rebuild their country, a lesson in firmness and resistance to the entire world.
After this break, the body of Zimbabwe's former president, Robert Mugabe, is on its way back to the country. Stay with us. Thank you for joining us again. In a rare public appearance, the president of Cameroon, Paul Biya, has announced a national dialogue to end the conflict in the country. Over the past 2 years, the ongoing conflict between security forces and armed separatists from the Anglophone minority in the West has left over 2,000 people dead.
That's why I have decided to convene, at the end of this month, a major national dialogue that will enable us, within the limits of our Constitution, to examine ways and means of meeting the deep aspirations of the peoples of the Northwest and Southwest, but also of all the other components of our nation.
A United Nations independent human rights expert has said that Qatar still has a long way to go in addressing the widespread abuse of migrant domestic workers. Speaking during a workshop for migrant workers' rights, Obiora Okafor said while the situation has improved, much more still needs to be done. A recent report by the International Organization for Migration says physical and mental abuse of migrant workers is rampant across the Middle East. According to the report, workers frequently face having their passports confiscated and restrictions on their movements and communications.
Many domestic workers continue to work long hours. Some of them have reported up to 16 hours daily, with few realistic avenues to protest, despite this being prohibited by the law. Many are denied mobile phones by employers, hindering their access to the outside world.
The body of Zimbabwe's former president Robert Mugabe has left the funeral parlor in Singapore and will be flown home on Wednesday. The plane carrying his body will leave Singapore on Wednesday morning, and it is expected to arrive in Zimbabwe in the late afternoon. According to reports, Mugabe's family is against the government's plan to bury him at the National Heroes Acre Monument in Harare, preferring his home village. A state funeral will be held on Saturday in Harare before burial scheduled for the following day on Sunday. The final place of burial has not yet been confirmed. Zimbabwe's main opposition party has postponed the celebration of its 20th anniversary to attend the late president's funeral. The leader of the Movement for Democratic Change, Nelson Chamisa, announced that his party has postponed its anniversary celebration in honor of the late president. Chamisa also said that the party leadership was going to attend the funeral of Robert Mugabe. The MDC anniversary has been postponed to September 28th.
What does success look like? We are not going to be trying and show ourselves to be, more mourners than the others, or more people who are believing than the others. This is an event to give honor to Mr. Mugabe. It's only necessary that we do that. Mind you, we say that he contributed positively and negatively. And let's be objective about the contributions. We will not emphasize the negative, but the opportunity to do so is with us, so that we are able to build on the negatives. We are able to then correct the mistakes, right the wrongs, and also negate the negatives that we have seen. It's all out to us, and we have the duty as people, as citizens, together.
Palestinian leaders have denounced as a war crime plans by Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, to annex a large part of the West Bank if he wins next week's election in Israel. The prime minister says he will immediately apply Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and the northern Dead Sea if voters back him at the polls next Tuesday. Around 65,000 Palestinians live in those areas, which Israel occupied in the 1967 war. Netanyahu said he would wait for an agreement with U.S. President Donald Trump before annexing other areas of the West Bank.
What Prime Minister Netanyahu said tonight about asking his people for a mandate to allow that will enable him to annex the Jordan Valley is paramount to a war crime. Annexation of occupied territories is a war crime. So Mr. Netanyahu and those who help or aid Mr. Netanyahu in such a vision of annexing Jerusalem, annexing Hebron, annexing the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, and then keeping Palestinians in their small towns and villages as prisoners without any freedom, that is a war crime. And as we are about to enter the 74th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, the international community must stand tall now, all, to say a big no and to stop treating Israel as a country above the laws of man.
And the Arab League has said that Netanyahu's plans to annex large parts of the West Bank will derail the Israeli-Palestine peace process. The League's Secretary General Ahmed Gate told journalists in Cairo on Tuesday that Netanyahu's announcement is in violation of international law and represents a new aggression against Palestine by the government of Israel. He added that the League will use all means to oppose any Israeli policy that seeks to grab Palestinian territory.
A statement from the Council of the Arab League on the ministerial level in an irregular emergency session regarding the announcement of the Prime Minister of the Israel occupation about his intention of annexing parts of the occupied West Bank for Israel's sovereignty. Cairo, September 10, 2019. The statement stipulates that the Arab League Ministerial Council which met in an irregular emergency session, expresses its deep condemnation and absolute rejection of the announcement made by the Prime Minister of the Israeli occupation on the evening of Tuesday, September 10, 2019, regarding his intentions of annexing parts of the occupied West Bank of the year 1967. The Council considers this announcement as a dangerous progression and a new Israel aggression, one that violates international law. The United Nations Declaration, as well as legitimate international decisions such as Security Council Decision number 338 and 242, the Council considers these statements as undermining any chances of progress in the peace process, eradicating its foundation. The Council announces its determinations to follow up with these new aggressive Israeli statements, as well as its readiness to undertake all procedures, legal and political actions to resist this Israel policy, which aims to increase conflict and violence in the region. Arab action will be taken with the Security Council, the General Assembly of the United Nations, international organizations, and members of the international community.
Huge fires are raging across vast areas of Malaysia's rainforests, some of the world's biggest, with toxic smog shutting hundreds of schools in the region. Thousands of firefighters are battling fires in massive jungle areas in Sumatra and Borneo Islands. These fires are frequently started to clear land for crop plantations. Air quality has dropped to unhealthy levels in and around the capital, Kuala Lumpur. And with that, we end our news brief, but you can find all of our stories by checking our website, telestrouenglish.net. And be sure to join us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.